It was 3:17 a.m. when the military-grade alarm on my phone screamed like a missile alert and lit up the entire bedroom. I jolted awake, heart slamming in my chest. The notification read, "Unauthorized movement, prototype Echo Wolf in transit." For a second I thought it was a glitch. Then I heard the distant clink of chains and the low rumble of a diesel engine. I shot out of bed, bare feet slapping against the hardwood, and bolted outside. There it was, my old, dusty military truck being dragged away on a flatbed, tail lights fading into the dark. I screamed, not because it was my vehicle, but because those morons just towed a rolling defense project still wired to Pentagon Live Systems. They had no idea what they'd just touched. And judging by the satellite tracking pinging red on my phone, the government did. I whispered to myself, "Karen, you really just triggered a federal response over your hatred for Rust." It had all started a few weeks ago when I rolled Echo Wolf onto my driveway. The truck looked like something out of a scrapyard to anyone who didn't know better: dented doors, matte black paint coated with road dust, and a windshield that hadn't been wiped since last winter. But underneath that deception was the most advanced AI recon module ever installed in a land vehicle. I wasn't allowed to say much. I was under a defense contract as a civilian engineering consultant, and the truck was on loan as part of a stealth durability test in real-world settings. I was instructed not to reveal its nature, not to move it unnecessarily, and not to let unauthorized personnel near it. Simple. Except when you live under the thumb of a woman like Karen Whitmore. Karen was the self-declared queen of our HOA. Mid-50s, iron-pressed blonde bob, and a permanent frown that could curdle milk. She had a laminated rulebook she carried like scripture, and the attitude of someone who thought she was God's personal messenger to keep the world beige and lifeless. The moment she saw my truck, she practically choked on her kale smoothie. The next morning, I found a neon orange violation notice duct-taped to my mailbox. The reason? Vehicle in public view does not meet aesthetic standards. I chuckled, tore it up, and went about my day. But Karen wasn't one to let things go. That same afternoon, she returned. This time with her miniature poodle in one arm and her smartphone in the other, recording as she barked at me from the sidewalk. She demanded I move the scrap metal death trap immediately. I calmly explained it was a government vehicle undergoing testing and showed her a printed exemption letter from my project lead. She didn't even look at it, just squinted at me like I was conning her and muttered something about fake military cosplayers before stomping away. The next few days were a parade of ridiculousness. One morning I found yellow caution tape stretched across my driveway with a note: "Hazardous vehicle quarantined by HOA safety guidelines." Another time, I caught Karen taking pictures of the truck from behind my neighbor's hedge. I reported her trespassing to the HOA board, but surprise, surprise, she was the president. And apparently, the rest of the board were either too spineless or too amused to intervene. One of them, a guy named Todd, whispered to me at a community potluck, "She once tried to fine a guy for hanging a bird feeder. You're basically in a Cold War now." Knowing where this was headed, I sent an official cease and desist email to the HOA and copied in my federal liaison. I warned them that this wasn't just a personal vehicle and any unauthorized action could trigger national security complications. My contact, Agent Mendez, called me after reading it and said, "If they touch that truck, we don't just show up with a tow. We show up with clearance badges and containment units." I told him I'd keep an eye on things. I shouldn't have let my guard down. Then came that fateful night. The moon was barely visible, and the neighborhood was still. I remember because I had just gotten into bed, barely 2 hours before the alarm went off. Karen must have known I'd be asleep. The tow truck she hired didn't have any visible company branding, clearly not a professional crew. I sprinted out into the front yard in nothing but a t-shirt and shorts, waving my arms like a maniac. Hey, you can't tow that!" I yelled, but they had already hooked the winch and were halfway down the street. I pulled out my phone and activated the prototype's emergency lockdown. Too late. The tampering already triggered breach protocols, and my screen blinked with a skull-shaped alert icon I never wanted to see outside a simulation. Defense Breach Code 910, AI Containment Mobilized. That meant black SUVs. That meant unmarked helicopters. That meant questions I couldn't answer in public. I stood frozen on the curb as the truck disappeared, heart pounding. Karen had done it. She had crossed the line, and not just into illegal HOA enforcement. She had officially triggered a federal operation. By 5 a.m., the silence in the neighborhood was shattered by a convoy of matte black government vehicles rolling through the gates. I watched from my porch as agents in plain suits canvassed the area, knocking on doors, asking for surveillance footage. Karen emerged from her house wearing a pink silk robe and slippers like it was just another morning to water her roses. When she saw the agents, she smiled, actually smiled, and said, "Oh good, someone's finally doing something about that trash heap." The lead agent flipped open a badge so fast it made her step back. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I saw her face drop. That smug smile melted into confusion, then fear, then full-blown panic. One of the agents pointed to her house. She tried to argue. They pointed again. She walked back inside, and 2 agents followed her in. I got a call from Mendez as the sun rose. He sounded irritated but calm. "Jack, your HOA president just put us on high alert. We've got Echo Wolf flagged as compromised. We're retrieving it from the tow yard now." I asked if I should come. He responded with something that sent a chill down my spine. "Come? No, you need to be here. You're the only one who can deactivate it if they tried to power it up." That meant something worse. If they tried to tinker with the systems, they could trigger full lockdown or worse. Scramble the encrypted GPS tracker to transmit false locations. I grabbed my jacket and keys and rushed out, only to find my driveway blocked by a black sedan. An agent stepped out and nodded. "Mr. Halvorson? We're your ride. Let's go secure Echo Wolf." As we drove off, I looked back at the HOA clubhouse, now surrounded by federal agents and marked off with yellow tape. Karen stood behind the glass doors, arms crossed, staring daggers through the window like she couldn't comprehend what she had just unleashed. I almost felt bad. Almost. But the game had changed. This wasn't just a feud over a truck. This was national property. This was espionage-level stupidity. And I had a front-row seat to watch Karen's entire rulebook come crashing down under the weight of her own arrogance. As the government sedan whisked me away from my neighborhood, I sat in the back seat staring at the GPS feed of the prototype truck on my phone screen. The signal showed it had been stationary at a local tow yard on the outskirts of town for just over an hour. I could only imagine what kind of chaos the operators had stirred up trying to figure out why the vehicle's doors wouldn't open and the engine refused to respond to normal ignition methods. The Echo Wolf prototype wasn't just sealed up for protection, it had been designed with defensive countermeasures that made it act more like a dormant guard dog than a passive piece of metal. And if anyone attempted to tamper with its wiring or systems, the Pentagon would be forced to treat the situation as a high-level breach. My stomach churned at the thought of a couple of tow guys triggering a national incident while Karen sat at home sipping coffee and pretending she hadn't just messed with something way out of her jurisdiction. Agent Mendez was already waiting when we pulled into the tow yard. He didn't waste time. He waved me over to the side entrance while several armed agents secured the perimeter. The manager of the yard, a burly guy in his 60s named Ray, stood by a chain-link fence with a cigarette trembling in his fingers. His face was flushed red, eyes darting between the agents and the truck like he expected to be arrested on the spot. When he saw me, he made a beeline and practically shouted, "I didn't know. That lady said it was an abandoned wreck and she paid me cash up front. I swear I didn't touch anything inside." I tried to pop the door, but it wouldn't budge, and then this alarm started blaring from somewhere inside the dash. It kept repeating some code. "What the hell is that thing?" Mendez cut him off with a raised hand and motioned for silence. I approached the truck slowly, pulling out the deactivation badge that had been issued to me when I first received Echo Wolf. As I drew closer, the truck's infrared sensors picked up my approach. The windshield display flickered to life from within, showing a blank screen with a single word blinking in red: Authenticate. I pressed the badge to the sensor pad behind the left mirror, and the system responded with a low mechanical click as the locks disengaged. I opened the door carefully and climbed inside. Everything was just as I'd left it, aside from a new layer of grime from the tow yard. The console blinked with several urgent messages, none of which had been triggered during the original testing phase. One of the messages flagged an attempt to power the vehicle using an external voltage spike, a classic amateur move likely done by the tow operator trying to jump-start it. Another entry had logged voice commands from someone yelling, which the system marked as unauthorized intrusion attempts. The AI had flagged the breach and sent data straight to the defense network. I sighed, typed in my override code, and initiated safe mode. Slowly, the alerts dimmed, and the vehicle settled into standby. Outside, Mendez stood with his arms folded, watching everything with a tight jaw. We spent the next few hours taking statements, logging sensor data, and running diagnostic. Once it was confirmed that the internal systems hadn't been physically accessed, the response was scaled down slightly. Still, Mendez informed me that a formal report had been sent up the chain, and the Department of Defense would be pressing charges against whoever authorized the unauthorized tow. That meant Karen. And possibly Ray too, though his cooperation and visible panic had likely earned him some leniency. When Ray was told what he had towed, he went pale and nearly collapsed onto a stool, mumbling something about early retirement. By midday, the Echo Wolf was back on my property, flanked by 2 unmarked sedans parked on either side of my driveway. Mendez made it clear that until the investigation was complete, the vehicle was to remain under surveillance, and any HOA action or interference would result in immediate escalation. I agreed and thanked him. Before leaving, he turned to me with a smirk and said, "You might want to prep for a press storm. Something like this doesn't stay quiet for long." I had no idea how fast things would explode. By late afternoon, several news vans had rolled into the neighborhood. One of the neighbors, probably the same person who always posted photos of Karen's antics on the local Facebook group, had leaked details of the tow and federal response. The headline was sensationalized enough to sound fake. HOA President tows secret government truck, triggers military invasion. But the images of black SUVs and agents pacing the sidewalks were very real. A local reporter tried to ask me questions while I was retrieving mail, but I brushed him off. I had no intention of throwing gasoline on the fire. Karen, however, had other plans. Around 6 p.m., she marched across the street in full makeup and a blazer like she was about to deliver a TED Talk. With her phone in one hand and a freshly printed HOA rulebook in the other, she demanded that I remove the weaponized vehicle from the community. Her voice was shrill, and her face was contorted with some mixture of desperation and fury. "I don't care who you called or what kind of toy soldiers showed up. This is a peaceful neighborhood, and your truck is a threat to safety. The HOA has rights, and I will exercise them." I didn't respond. I just stared at her while the 2 agents posted by my mailbox walked over and politely asked her to step back. She wasn't expecting resistance. She tried to argue, pulling out a copy of the rulebook and reading clauses about unauthorized vehicles, visual disruptions, and aesthetic compliance. One of the agents pulled out a small folder, opened it, and showed her a sealed document with federal seals she didn't recognize. Her mouth snapped shut. Her eyes scanned the paper but didn't understand a word. "This supersedes any neighborhood agreement," the agent said. "Your actions have already resulted in a federal investigation. You are advised to cease communication with Mr. Halvorsen and await further contact from legal counsel." Karen's hand trembled as she lowered the rulebook, then spun on her heel and stormed back toward her house without another word. That night, The HOA held an emergency meeting, which I was not invited to, but the results leaked out within the hour. The board was panicking. Several members who had initially supported Karen's actions were now backpedaling, afraid of being implicated. One of them, an elderly man named Stewart, left a handwritten apology on my doorstep claiming he'd been misled about the vehicle's legal status and had no idea it was part of a military test. It was obvious the board was preparing for the storm that was coming. They had no idea how bad it would get. The real surprise came the next morning when I received a phone call from someone I never expected, Major Terrence Monroe, the lead coordinator of the Echo Wolf project. His voice was calm but edged with concern. "Jack, we've reviewed the incident, and we're escalating this into a formal security breach. There are also secondary consequences we need to prepare for. The incident has already made its way into congressional briefings. A civilian board tampering with protected equipment doesn't sit well with oversight committees." I asked if there would be more agents. He paused before saying, "More than that. We may need to take temporary control of the entire neighborhood for investigation." I nearly dropped the phone. The idea that a neighborhood governed by a power-tripping woman obsessed with paint shades and mailbox alignment was about to be turned into a federal control zone was both terrifying and hilarious. I looked out the window at my truck, still ugly as ever but now flanked by government cars, and realized this situation was far from over. Karen had kicked a hornet's nest, and the swarm hadn't even begun to descend yet. By the time the weekend arrived, the neighborhood was no longer the quiet, tightly trimmed suburb it used to be. The air buzzed with tension. The agents hadn't left. They had, in fact, increased in number. The two unmarked black cars that had flanked my driveway were now joined by a mobile surveillance van and a tech truck with a temporary dish that glinted under the sun like a warning sign. People slowed their cars as they drove by. Neighbors walked their dogs deliberately slower in front of my house, pretending to be on the phone while sneaking glances. Someone even flew a drone overhead, which was promptly grounded when a man in a gray suit calmly stepped out of the van and pointed directly at it. The drone landed in the middle of the street and was confiscated in silence. Karen, for once, was nowhere to be seen. But the silence wasn't peace. It was pressure building behind her closed curtains. I could sense it. Karen wasn't the type to surrender quietly. She was plotting. Meanwhile, I tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. I mowed my lawn, washed the sides of my house, and even repainted the mailbox just to avoid the creeping sense that I was now living in the middle of a spy thriller. The prototype truck sat motionless but ever watched. I hadn't driven it since the tow incident. And even if I wanted to, the override protocol would keep it locked in place until the Department of Defense completed its evaluation. That evaluation didn't just involve the truck. No, it now included the entire HOA structure. What started as a petty act of overreach had opened a legal sinkhole that threatened to swallow the board whole. Karen's past violations, buried under years of HOA privilege, were being dug up one by one. I learned from one of the newer board members, Cindy, that Karen had long manipulated votes by changing meeting minutes and bullying residents into silence with threats of fines and inspections. She had installed cameras around the HOA clubhouse under the guise of security, but apparently she had live access from her own home. People joked she ran her own CIA from the guest bedroom. It wasn't funny anymore. Federal investigators began requesting old financial records from the HOA. What they found was a mess of inconsistencies. Karen had authorized renovations, landscaping projects, and security upgrades that never appeared in budget reports. When questioned, she claimed verbal approvals from board members, most of whom either denied it or said they were pressured into silence. One particularly shady expense included payments to a local tow company, the same one that had illegally removed my truck, for several undocumented vehicle removals over the past 2 years. Some of the supposed recipients of those violations didn't even live in the neighborhood anymore. That's when the investigators realized Karen had been running her own system of punishment, towing cars she deemed unattractive or inconvenient, whether they violated rules or not. The fallout came quickly. Karen's house was raided one morning. It wasn't loud or dramatic. No sirens, no yelling. Just a group of agents entering her property with sealed warrant. They emerged later with 3 boxes, 2 laptops, and a desktop computer. Karen stood on the porch, shouting about her rights and privacy, but no one paid her any attention. A neighbor across the street filmed the whole thing from behind his curtain and uploaded it online with the caption, "HOA Queen gets dethroned." The clip went viral overnight. News vans returned, but now they weren't interested in my truck. They wanted the full scope of Karen's downfall. Reporters interviewed neighbors who shared their own horror stories. Fines for leaving garbage bins visible for more than 30 minutes, threats over the height of Halloween decorations, cease and desist letters for having wind chimes. One woman claimed Karen tried to cite her for aggressive tulip growth, because her garden had spread into the space between houses. Another man admitted Karen had demanded he repaint his fence because it didn't match her neighborhood palette. All of these sounded ridiculous on their own, but together they painted a picture of someone who had wielded a little authority like a sledgehammer. The HOA board was collapsing. 3 members resigned within 48 hours, including Todd, the guy who once joked about me being in a Cold War. He left a note in everyone's mailbox apologizing and admitting he had been afraid to stand up to Karen. Cindy, one of the only sane board members, held a public meeting on my front lawn, partly because the clubhouse was still taped off by federal agents, and partly because she said it was time the community took responsibility for what had happened. Almost 40 people showed up. It was surreal. There I stood, next to my supposedly ugly truck, now revered as the catalyst that freed the neighborhood from its tyrant. Cindy introduced a proposal to dissolve the current HOA leadership structure and hold a community-wide vote to form a new one, governed by actual legal counsel and transparency. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry when someone nominated me as a potential board member. I respectfully declined. The last thing I wanted was to trade Pentagon-level projects for lawn sign dispute. But I offered to help vet candidates and advise on compliance, quietly in the background. But the biggest twist was still coming. The Department of Defense wasn't done. Echo Wolf had been designed for urban resilience and public integration testing, and the neighborhood incident had ironically created the perfect real-world stress scenario. A few days later, I received a sealed package with a letter from Major Monroe. It detailed plans for Phase 2 of the testing protocol. Instead of removing the vehicle, the department wanted to install a satellite node directly in the neighborhood. Echo Wolf would remain stationed in my driveway, monitored and maintained, and the surrounding blocks would be used as a controlled civilian test grid. In other words, Karen's obsession with removing the truck had accidentally turned our neighborhood into a defense-grade pilot zone. I wasn't sure whether to be proud or terrified. When I told Cindy, she laughed so hard she had to sit down. "This is better than any revenge plot I've ever seen," she said. "Karen tried to erase your truck from existence. Now she lives in a Pentagon-monitored zone because of it." As the sun set, I watched agents packing up the mobile van, replacing it with a more discreet tower unit that looked like a decorative utility pole. It blended right in. Most people wouldn't even know it was transmitting encrypted data 24/7. Echo Wolf had received a new matte black paint job and a subtle DoD logo on its rear panel. No one would mistake it for a junker again. That evening, I saw Karen for the first time in days. She stepped outside just long enough to collect her mail. Her posture had changed. No swagger, no tight grip on her clipboard. She looked smaller, defeated. Her eyes met mine from across the street, but she said nothing. Just turned and walked back inside. I stood there for a moment, thinking about everything. How a rusted truck almost caused an international incident. How one woman's obsession with control had brought her world crashing down. and how sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people reveal who they really are, one arrogant decision at a time. In the week that followed, the neighborhood entered a strange limbo. On the surface, everything appeared normal. Lawns were trimmed, sprinklers clicked to life at their scheduled hours, and the usual joggers made their rounds with earbuds in and heads down. But underneath, there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. A stillness, like the quiet after a thunderstorm but before you've assessed the damage. For the first time in years, people walked past my driveway without sneering or snapping photos. They nodded politely. A few even stopped to apologize, often beginning with awkward lines like "I never really liked Karen anyway" or "I always thought that truck looked important." One man, who once signed a petition to have me evicted for noise violation during a garage project, dropped off a six-pack of local beer and muttered thanks under his breath before hurrying away. It was like the entire street had suddenly realized it had been under a spell and now struggled with the shame of having gone along with it. But while the surface was calm, the undercurrents were anything but. The legal fallout from Karen's decision to tow the Echo Wolf truck was moving like a tidal wave, slow but impossible to stop. Federal investigators had now opened 2 official cases, one regarding the unlawful towing of classified equipment and another centered on the alleged financial misconduct within the HOA's fund. Karen was under investigation for both, and she was spiraling. She hadn't left her property in days. Her once immaculate front lawn now had a withering edge to it, flower pots overturned, the poodle barking at nothing through the bay window. It was hard to believe this was the same woman who once fined a family for having a garden gnome because it didn't align with neighborhood decor harmony. The irony hit its peak when a Department of Defense press liaison held a low-key press briefing just a few streets away. Not in some office or government building. Right in our own park gazebo, the same place Karen once banned kids from riding scooters. A small crowd gathered as the liaison calmly explained that due to an HOA member's unauthorized actions, a military testing asset had been endangered. The department's statement was firm but diplomatic, aimed at preventing mass panic. He reassured residents that Echo Wolf was not dangerous when operated under protocol, and that their neighborhood would now serve as a secure, low-level testing zone to study how military vehicles could integrate in residential contexts without causing disruption. It was, as he put it, a national first. A local grandmother whispered to her grandson, "So we live in a science experiment now?" But the funniest part, if anything about this situation could be called funny, was how the very rules Karen used to weaponize her position were now being used against her. I had filed a formal complaint with the HOA's legal review officer, attaching evidence of her trespassing, falsifying violation records, and the illegal use of HOA funds to pay for the towing service. The HOA's bylaws, which she wrote, had no mechanism for immunity. Within those same rules was a clause stating any member found guilty of financial misconduct or unethical use of power could be removed by a 51% resident vote, with permanent barring from any future HOA position. At Cindy's suggestion, we initiated the vote. In the days that followed, the signature sheets filled faster than anyone anticipated. People who had once been afraid of her now knocked on doors to gather support. The entire neighborhood had flipped. One neighbor even printed T-shirts that said "Free Echo Wolf" on the front and "I survived the HOA" on the back. I couldn't tell if it was satire or solidarity, but it didn't matter. The votes were collected, tallied, and sent off for notarization. By Friday evening, Karen was officially stripped of her title. A public notice was placed on the HOA bulletin board, which had previously been a shrine to her memos and passive-aggressive warnings. Her name was removed from the website. Just like that, her reign ended, not with a gavel, but with a quiet, undeniable wave of community consensus. That night, she lost it. It started with the sound of breaking glass. I had just sat down with dinner when the distinct crash of something shattering echoed across the street. I stepped out onto the porch and saw Karen in her driveway, screaming at no one. Her poodle was barking hysterically, and in her hand she held a shattered picture frame. Bits of glass glittered at her feet as she kicked over a potted plant and hurled her clipboard, the infamous clipboard, into the air like a frisbee. A small group of residents gathered across the road, unsure whether to intervene or let her unravel. I opted for the latter. She yelled about betrayal, about how she had built this community with her own hands, about how she made it better and safer and cleaner, and now everyone had turned on her because of one truck. One ugly, cursed truck. And then she pointed straight at me. "You did this. You and your stupid war toy. I tried to help this neighborhood, and you ruined everything. You brought the government into our homes. You sold us out." Her voice cracked as she screamed. Her dog growled at her feet, clearly confused by her sudden rage. The agents across the street didn't even flinch. They watched calmly from beside their unmarked vehicle. One of them made a note on a small tablet. Karen, realizing no one was reacting the way she wanted, turned and stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. It would have been comedic if it wasn't so uncomfortable to watch someone unravel like that. By morning, she was gone. Not arrested. Not taken in the night by agents. Just gone. A moving truck sat in her driveway for 2 hours. Movers packed boxes under the strained glare of federal observers. She didn't speak to anyone. Didn't say goodbye. The only sign she had ever lived there was the perfectly symmetrical topiary that now looked a little dry and the faint remnants of the custom welcome to our community sign she had installed herself. Word spread quickly. Karen had fled to stay with her sister 2 counties over. The federal case was still ongoing, but apparently her lawyer had advised a quiet disappearance while negotiations were underway. She hadn't been charged yet, but it was only a matter of time. And she knew it. In the absence of her suffocating presence, the neighborhood took a collective breath. The HOA board, now functioning as a temporary committee under Cindy's leadership, issued a public apology to all residents affected by wrongful violations over the past 5 years. They launched an effort to reimburse fines and were actively rebuilding trust. New proposals were drafted. Ones that focused on transparency, real community involvement, and checks against future abuse. It was the first time I had seen actual smiles at a community meeting. And through it all, Echo Wolf remained parked where it always had been. Not because it had to be, but because it now represented something far more powerful than its hardware. It was a symbol. A rolling reminder that authority without accountability leads to collapse. That petty control, when pushed too far, will always meet resistance, sometimes in the form of neighbors, sometimes in the form of military-grade consequences. I took a moment, later that week, to finally sit in the driver's seat again. The screen lit up. "Welcome back, Jack. System integrity nominal. Phase 2 pending." I smiled. The truck was fine. The tech had held. And in the process, so had I. The fight wasn't about a vehicle. It never had been. It was about drawing the line between power and principle, between community and tyranny. And for once, the right side had won. The morning after Karen disappeared from the neighborhood, everything felt oddly brighter. Maybe it was just the cloudless sky, or maybe it was the way the neighborhood collectively exhaled after years of walking on eggshells. For once, there were no passive-aggressive notes taped to mailboxes, no patrols of clipboards inspecting flower beds, no random warnings for slightly cracked fences. It was peaceful in a way no one had realized they were missing. And in the center of it all, parked like an oversized monument to irony and justice, sat Echo Wolf. Its matte black shell caught the morning light, sleek and unbothered, surrounded now by admiration rather than suspicion. Kids pointed at it when they passed, parents nodded respectfully, and the neighborhood, for the first time in a long time, felt like it actually belonged to its people again. Despite the calm, things hadn't fully settled. The Department of Defense was still actively managing the site. The surveillance node that had been installed blended seamlessly into the surrounding infrastructure, but agents were still present. They now operated with a lighter footprint, but their presence was constant, like a background hum you couldn't hear but could always feel. I'd gotten used to their quiet nods, the occasional check-in, the polite but firm reminders about protocol. They weren't there to interfere with daily life. They were there to ensure what had happened wouldn't happen again. After all, Echo Wolf wasn't just a vehicle anymore. It was a case study, a security milestone, and a very expensive lesson about how something seemingly mundane could spark a national breach. It wasn't long before the media returned. This time, not for a scandal, but for a story. A major news outlet had picked up the timeline of events and wanted an exclusive feature. At first, I declined. I wasn't interested in turning this into a spectacle. But after some persuasion and a promise that they'd focus on the bigger picture, the intersection of federal assets and overreaching local authorities, I agreed. The interview was simple. A few cameras on my porch, a reporter with good posture and a calm voice, and me explaining what had happened without exaggeration. Just the facts. How a private contractor following federal orders became the target of an HOA president's crusade against appearances. How ignoring warnings and violating federal boundaries had led to a community-wide collapse of trust. And how, in the end, a truck most people had laughed at became the thing that exposed years of abuse. The piece aired 2 days later. It was balanced, respectful, and surprisingly impactful. It didn't just go viral. It started conversations. Forums lit up with debates about HOA powers, property rights, and how often community leaders operate without oversight. Military blogs praised the resilience of Echo Wolf and the Defense Department's response. Legal experts weighed in on the implications of a civilian triggering a federal breach through ignorance and arrogance. And through it all, my inbox filled with messages from people across the country saying they dealt with their own versions of Karen. People shared their horror stories of unfair fines, forced removals, and threats over things as small as mailbox color. It was like a floodgate opened, and Echo Wolf had been the battering ram. Meanwhile, the HOA went through a complete restructuring. Cindy and a temporary committee worked tirelessly to implement new bylaws that included accountability measures, term limits, and mandatory community approval for any major action. Transparency became the central focus. All meetings were recorded and publicly posted. All spending was itemized. And most importantly, the residents were finally involved in decisions that affected their daily lives. The board no longer ruled from a position of control but from a place of service. And while it would take time to rebuild trust, the change was undeniable. As for Karen, the last update I received came from one of the federal investigators. She had officially been charged on 2 counts: unauthorized interference with classified equipment and misuse of HOA funds. The first charge, though serious, was likely to be negotiated down due to the lack of malicious intent, though the feds weren't taking it lightly. The second charge had legs. Financial records showed that over a 5-year period, Karen had used HOA funds for personal purchases masked as community upgrade. A backyard gazebo she'd claimed was a community wellness center turned out to be her private wine bar. Security lights billed to the neighborhood were installed only on her property. Even the infamous security camera system around the clubhouse had been routed through her home internet, giving her private access to every angle. It wasn't just unethical. It was calculated. The feds had no intention of letting that slide. She was set to face a court date in a few months. In the meantime, her house was listed for sale. She had moved to a small town hours away, and from what I heard, was living with a cousin while trying to keep a low profile. But in the age of social media, low profiles didn't last long. Her name had become synonymous with HOA tyranny, a cautionary tale across every platform imaginable. One clever content creator even made an animated reenactment of the story using audio from the news feature, complete with Karen's meltdown dramatized with cartoon explosions and dramatic music. It was hard not to laugh. Even Echo Wolf had become a meme. People edited it into superhero posters, dubbed it the neighborhood tank, and even gave it its own parody social media account that posted quotes like, "Still waiting for someone to tow me again." But beyond the humor, something more important had taken root. Accountability. What started as a personal nightmare had turned into a blueprint for change. A nearby neighborhood invited Cindy to speak at their board meeting about what we'd learned. A few more followed. The HOA Reformation movement wasn't just a phrase anymore. It was gaining traction. People were done being bullied by clipboards and arbitrary power. They wanted fairness, clarity, humanity, and in some strange way I had helped ignite that. Still, I wasn't one to seek credit. I spent most of my days maintaining the truck, reporting to my defense contact, and helping the Department of Defense gather post-incident data. Phase 2 of the Echo Wolf project involved neighborhood simulation mapping, and I was tasked with collecting feedback from residents on how they perceived the vehicle's presence. Most said it made them feel safer now. Some joked about it having Karen repellent mode. A few parents asked if it could be brought to school events for students to see. It had gone from being an eyesore to a local hero, and that transformation was both surreal and deeply satisfying. One evening, while watching the sun dip below the trees, I found myself staring at the truck, thinking about everything that had happened. How close I had come to losing control. How Karen's unchecked authority could have ended in disaster. How a single misjudged tow triggered one of the most transformative periods our neighborhood had ever seen. It reminded me of something one of the agents had said in passing. Sometimes it's not the truck. It's what the truck reveals. In the end, Karen had revealed everything. Not just her own corruption, but the weaknesses in the system that allowed her to thrive. Her downfall wasn't just about me. It was about all the people she'd silenced, all the petty fines she'd dished out, and all the neighbors who had felt like prisoners in their own homes. Echo Wolf hadn't just been a military vehicle. It had been a mirror. And when it reflected back the truth, the entire community finally woke up. As the neighborhood settled into its new rhythm, and the kids chalked hopscotch outlines near the sidewalk without fear of being yelled at, I leaned back in my chair and took a deep breath. The battle was over. The lesson had been learned. And for the first time in a long while, peace wasn't just a hope. It was real. Echo Wolf sat silently beside me, still and powerful, no longer just a prototype, but a legend in its own right.